For most dinosaurs, water was a boundary, a place to drink, a place to cross, a place where danger could hide beneath the surface. But one predator began to change that rule. In the river systems of ancient North Africa, something enormous moved through the green water, not like a crocodile, not like a fish, and not quite like any dinosaur the world had seen before. Its skull was long and narrow, built like a trap. Its teeth were made for slippery prey. Its bones carried strange signs of a life spent closer to water than land, and rising from its back was a towering sail, cutting through the surface like the warning flag of a creature evolution was still experimenting with. This was Spinosaurus. For decades, scientists tried to understand it as just another giant meat eating dinosaur, a rival to Tyrannosaurus, a monster of the land. But the more fossils they found, the stranger the story became. Spinosaurus did not seem built for the same world as other predators. Its body pointed somewhere else, toward rivers, toward swamps, toward a shadowy hunting ground where the rules of dinosaur life began to blur. And that raises one haunting question. Why would one of the largest predators ever to walk the earth begin moving away from land and into the water? Let's return to the rivers of ancient North Africa, where that story first began. 95 to 100 million years ago, a river system carved through what is now the Moroccan and Algerian Sahara. The Kem, it would later be named, though no human voice ever spoke that word while it flowed. It was not a single channel, but a braided network. Threads of water weaving through floodplains and swamps, marshes dense with vegetation that has long since turned to stone. The river drained toward the Tethys Sea, a warm, shallow ocean that stretched between two continents, separating Africa from Europe across waters that held their own enormous hunters. The climate was humid and tropical, the air thick with moisture, ferns grew tall along the banks, fish moved through the channels in schools too large to count, and through this landscape, along the water and across the ground, moved predators. Four of them dominated. Spinosaurus aegypticus, the longest of them all, its body stretched to proportions that had never existed before. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, a massive terrestrial hunter with teeth that could slice through flesh and bone. Deltadromeus agilis, smaller but still formidable, still capable of bringing down animals that would dwarf most modern creatures. And at least one abyssosaurid whose name science has never recovered, known only through fragments, a predator whose full form remains incomplete in the fossil record. All four were apex level, all four hunted in the same stretch of ground and water, all four competed for survival in the same ecosystem. This was not a stable arrangement. The numbers alone made no biological sense. Yet the rock containing their remains is among the most heavily studied Cretaceous formations in the world, and the fossils within it have generated scientific controversy for more than a century. The Kem beds speak clearly. The predators were there. The question of how they all survived together has never fully quieted. The story of their discovery began in 1915 when a paleontologist named Ernst Stromer described a dinosaur from fossils collected in Egypt. He called it Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the spiny lizard of Egypt, naming it for the remarkable sail along its back. Stromer's specimens became the reference point for everything that followed. Scientists studied them, measured them, built their understanding of this animal around the bones he had recovered. And then, in April of 1944, Allied bombings struck Munich's Deutsches Museum during the Second World War. The holotype specimens, the original fossil material that anchored the entire science, burned. Decades of paleontological progress were set back by a single night of fire, leaving future scientists to reconstruct the animal from fragments and descriptions, from casts and from memory. What emerged from that loss was persistence. New expeditions returned to the same rocks that Stromer had worked. More fossils surfaced. The picture grew more complete, though the original specimens remained ash. The Kem Formation continued to yield its secrets, bone by bone, tooth by tooth. Each new discovery raised the same fundamental problem. How does one ecosystem hold four apex predators? The answer, when it finally came, would require looking at the bones in ways scientists had never looked before. It would demand new tools, new chemical analysis, a willingness to see the familiar skeleton as something entirely strange. But that answer begins with a simple observation. The predators were there. The prey animals were not in proportion to them, and something had to explain why. In the Serengeti, a vast ecosystem where predators and prey move together across grassland and acacia woodland, 1% of all large animal biomass consists of predators. 1%. The remaining 99% is herbivores. Vast herds of wildebeest and zebra and gazelle, animals that convert grass to meat and muscle, animals that feed everything above them in the food chain. This ratio holds across nearly every documented ecosystem on Earth, ancient or modern. Predators rise and fall with the availability of prey. They are always dependent. They are always the minority. The arithmetic is not negotiable. More prey must exist for fewer predators, or the system collapses into starvation. The Kem formation breaks this arithmetic. Paleontologists studying the rocks did not find what ecosystems should contain. They found something inverted. Fossil tooth and bone analysis reveals large predatory theropods dramatically overrepresented relative to herbivorous prey animals. The imbalance is not subtle. It is unlike any other Mesozoic continental ecosystem that science has examined. In the rocks that formed 95 to 100 million years ago, predators dominate the assemblage. The herbivores are scarce by comparison. The numbers do not align with how life should arrange itself. Consider the predators themselves, their raw size made consecutive to emphasize the absurdity. Spinosaurus reached up to 15 meters, which is about 49 feet in length. Carcharodontosaurus stretched from 12 to 13 meters, roughly 39 to 43 feet. Deltadromeus achieved approximately 8 meters, that is nearly 26 feet. All three were carnivores. All three hunted in the same stretch of ground and water. All three shared the same geographic territory, the same climate, the same chem system. The size alone consumed tremendous amounts of protein. A 15-meter predator does not survive on small meals. Neither do a 12-meter predator and an 8-meter predator occupying the same hunting grounds. The fossil record preserved teeth and bones, the hard parts that survive the work of geology. Paleontologists counted them, measured them, sorted them by species and size. What emerged was troubling. The Kem beds should have yielded abundant remains of large herbivorous dinosaurs, the foundation of the food web. Instead, they yielded predator after predator after predator. The prey animals were there, certainly, but they appear far less frequently in the stone than the mathematics of an ecosystem would predict. A functioning predator population depends on prey that vastly outnumbers it. Here, that was not what the fossil assemblage revealed. The question that emerges from this imbalance is not esoteric. It is the simplest problem in ecology. If these three massive carnivores were all competing for the same prey in the same manner, the mathematics of survival would collapse. One of them would outcompete the others. Resources would divide among them, grow scarcer, fail entirely. Starvation would follow, yet the fossils suggest they coexisted for a measurable span of geological time. They did not starve out, they did not eliminate one another. Something else was happening in the chem-chem ecosystem, some arrangement that allowed multiple apex predators to thrive where the traditional rules said they should not. The answer to that puzzle begins with looking closely at a single question. Were these predators actually competing for the same food? Carcharodontosaurus saharicus owned the land. The skull of this animal embodied that dominion, large and deep, and built with geometric precision for the transfer of force. The bone was robust, thickened in the regions where muscles anchored, designed to generate and absorb the enormous bite forces necessary to hunt prey that was itself massive and protected. The jaw could close with power, the neck could wrench sideways with violence. Every structural element spoke to a predator engineered for direct confrontation with animals that would fight back. The teeth of Carcharodontosaurus were engineering in themselves. Thin and laterally flattened, they curved slightly backward, serrated along both edges like the blade of a saw. A tooth of this design does not crush bone through brute force. Instead, it opens flesh, creates catastrophic wounds, exploits the vulnerability of blood loss and shock. A Carcharodontosaurus would bite and hold, allowing the serrated edges to work through tissue while the prey weakened from hemorrhage. Patience combined with anatomical precision, this was the strategy written into the enamel itself. In 2015, biomechanicists at the University of Bristol named Henderson and Nichols published an analysis of this animal's bite force and neck leverage. A single adult Carcharodontosaurus, they calculated, could exert enough jaw and neck force to lift approximately 424 kilograms, which is about 934 pounds, from the ground. Two cooperating individuals could manage roughly 850 kilograms, nearly 1,870 pounds, a mass comparable to a subadult sauropod. These numbers were not theoretical abstractions. They represented the actual mechanical capability encoded in the creature's skeleton, the power latent in every bone. The prey itself left traces in the chem-chem beds. Rebachosaurus, a long-necked sauropod, reached lengths that made it one of the largest land animals of its era. Its remains are found throughout the formation, scattered as bones and teeth in rock layers that accumulated on terrestrial floodplains and coastal margins. This was the hunt that Carcharodontosaurus pursued. Enormous prey in open spaces where a large terrestrial predator could maneuver, where speed and power and the capacity to wound could be deployed against animals adapted to defend themselves on ground. Chemical evidence confirmed this reading of the fossil record. In 2010, researchers led by Amiot studied the oxygen isotope values preserved in the tooth enamel of chem-chem predators. Oxygen exists in slightly different weights, and the ratio between those weights in an animal's body reflects how that animal lives, how much time it spends in fresh water versus on dry land. Tooth enamel locks this ratio in place as it forms, preserving a chemical record millions of years old. Carcharodontosaurus yielded oxygen isotope values consistent with a terrestrial lifestyle, an animal that drank from land sources, that hunted on solid ground, that remained tethered to earth. The fossil distribution supported this pattern. Remains of Carcharodontosaurus appear predominantly in rock layers deposited on land rather than in river channels or coastal sediments. Carcharodontosaurus was the apex terrestrial predator of the chem-chem ecosystem. The skeleton announced it, the teeth confirmed it, the chemistry verified it, and the prey animals it hunted made it physical. This predator held dominion over the dry ground, the floodplains, the spaces where large herbivores, moved and fed and bore their young. It had no rivals there. It was supreme. And yet the Kem beds contained another predator, larger than itself, another massive hunter operating in the same ecosystem. If Carcharodontosaurus controlled the land, what space remained for Spinosaurus to occupy? Spinosaurus was larger. Modern estimates place it consistently between 14 and 15 meters, which is about 46 to 49 feet in total length. This made it the longest predatory dinosaur ever identified, surpassing Carcharodontosaurus by a margin of 2 to 3 meters, roughly 6 to 10 feet. In the hierarchy of predators, size confers advantage. Larger animals typically outcompete smaller ones for territory and prey. A bigger predator can claim the richest hunting grounds, can exclude rivals through sheer mass and power, can dominate the ecosystem's apex tier. The larger animal wins. This is the rule written across millions of years of vertebrate history. Yet, Spinosaurus did not dominate the terrestrial ecosystem of the Kem. Carcharodontosaurus held that title. The larger animal deferred to the smaller one on land, a reversal of the expected hierarchy that demands explanation. The answer lies in the limbs, specifically the hind limbs, those massive pillars that support a theropod's weight and drive its locomotion. Spinosaurus possessed hind limbs that were notably short relative to its total body length, proportionally shorter than those of any other large theropod of comparable size. The disproportion was not subtle. It was anatomically pronounced, visible to anyone comparing the skeleton of Spinosaurus to that of Tyrannosaurus, or Allosaurus, or Carcharodontosaurus itself. Stride length determines speed. Speed determines whether a land predator can pursue, overtake, and subdue fast-moving prey. A 15-meter animal with short legs cannot match the velocity of a 12-meter animal built for running. The physics are unforgiving. A creature bearing twice the mass of a human cannot move like a human. Spinosaurus on land would have been ponderous by comparison to Carcharodontosaurus. Slower, less agile, less capable of the explosive acceleration that terrestrial hunting demands. Size alone does not guarantee dominance. Proportions determine function, and the proportions of Spinosaurus announced a different life. Multiple skeletal reconstructions identified a center of mass shifted forward in the body, positioned differently than in other large theropods. In Tyrannosaurus, the weight distribution favors bipedal locomotion, allowing the animal to achieve high speeds on hind legs, while the tail acts as a counterbalance. Spinosaurus's weight distribution suggested something else entirely. The trunk was positioned in a way more consistent with a body that spent significant time horizontal, close to the ground or close to water. The spine angled differently. The pelvis sat in a location that would compromise running efficiency. Everything in the skeleton whispered of a creature adapted to move in a different medium, to spend its hours in a different posture than the bipedal sprint that defines terrestrial, predatory success. If Spinosaurus was not built to run down prey on land, the question becomes unavoidable. It was larger than any other predator in its ecosystem. It could not compete terrestrially through speed or agility. It did not possess the bite force of Carcharodontosaurus, the shearing teeth, the power to wound through hemorrhage. Something else was happening. Something else the skeleton contained. Something else the bones had been shaped for by millions of years of selection pressure. Spinosaurus was built for something. The question was what? Oxygen atoms come in different weights. This fact, mundane in chemistry, becomes extraordinary when preserved in fossilized tooth enamel. The ratio between lighter and heavier oxygen atoms in an animal's body reflects how that animal lived, how much time it spent in fresh water versus on dry land, how it drank and moved through its world. An animal, spending most of its life on land, accumulates one isotopic signature. An animal, spending significant time immersed in fresh water, accumulates another. The distinction is measurable, reproducible, permanent. Once tooth enamel forms during an animal's life, it locks this ratio in place. Time passes, geological epochs arrive and depart, continents shift, and inside the fossilized enamel, the chemical record endures, unchanged after 95 million years. In 2010, a research team led by Amiot analyzed oxygen isotope values from the teeth of chem-chem predators. They selected specimens with careful precision, extracted samples from the enamel, measured the isotopic ratios with instruments that could detect differences at scales most minds cannot visualize. The data emerged, numbers that represented not abstract chemistry but the literal biography of individual animals. The hours they spent in water or on land, written into calcium and phosphate, and that oxygen in different weights. Carcharodontosaurus appeared first in their analysis. The oxygen isotope ratios were higher, consistent with a terrestrial drinking pattern, matching the signatures of land-living animals. The animal drank from sources on dry ground, spent its hours moving through floodplains and across open spaces. The chemistry confirmed what the skeleton already suggested, what the prey, animals, and the fossil distribution had indicated. Carcharodontosaurus belonged to the land. Then Spinosaurus. The values were distinctly more negative, shifted in a direction that could mean only one thing. An animal with sustained, regular, deep contact with fresh water produced this signature. This was not an animal that occasionally visited a river to drink, not a predator that occasionally waded into shallows to hunt. The isotopic values indicated an animal that spent substantial portions of its life immersed, that lived in the water in a way that fundamentally altered the chemistry of its own body. The numbers were unambiguous. They could not be reinterpreted or explained away through alternative hypotheses. They pointed in one direction only. The difference between the two predators was stark. Carcharodontosaurus and Spinosaurus had occupied the same ecosystem, shared the same geological moment, existed in the same formations. Yet their oxygen isotope signatures placed them in entirely different environments. One animal belonged to dry ground, the other belonged to water. The conclusion pressed itself forward with the force of physical law. Spinosaurus was not visiting the water, it was living in it. The enamel of its teeth carried proof written in the language of chemistry itself, a testimony that had outlasted empires and continents and the disappearance of every other creature from its time. The animal had committed to the river. The river had committed to the animal. And now, millions of years later, the atoms themselves bore witness to that ancient covenant. A second chemical test arrived through calcium. Unlike oxygen, which reflects the environment an animal inhabits, calcium traces dietary source through the intricate paths of food chains. Aquatic food chains and terrestrial food chains carry measurably different calcium isotope ratios. Plants growing in water absorb calcium in proportions distinct from plants on land. Herbivores eating those plants incorporate those ratios into their own bodies. Predators consuming herbivores inherit the signature, passing it forward through the food web until it reaches the apex hunter and becomes locked into tooth enamel. The calcium isotope ratio thus reads the entire lineage backward, revealing whether a predator fed on terrestrial prey or aquatic prey, whether it hunted in rivers or on floodplains, whether its food came from water or from ground. The Kem-Kem beds of Morocco and the Gadufawa beds of Niger lie on different parts of the African continent, separated by hundreds of kilometers. Different fossil sites accumulate different animals, different assemblages, different distributions of life. Yet, when researchers analyzed calcium isotope values from predators at both locations, a pattern emerged that transcended geography. Spinosaurids at both sites clustered together with a distinctly negative calcium isotope signature. At the same locations, Carcharodontosaurids and Evolutionaries yielded different values, consistently higher, grouped separately. The Spinosaurs occupied one isotopic space, their competitors occupied another. The split was reproducible. It held across two different fossil beds on two different parts of the continent. The scientific weight of this convergence was substantial. Oxygen isotopes came from one research team examining one element through one biological mechanism. Calcium isotopes came from different researchers examining a different element through a different pathway. Two independent lines of chemical inquiry, conducted separately, pursuing different questions, arrived at the same conclusion. The methodology differed, the assumptions differed. The elements themselves were different, yet both pointed toward identical biology, identical ecology, identical lives. In paleontology, convergence across multiple independent datasets is as strong a form of evidence as the fossil record permits. It is the closest thing to certainty that deep time allows. This pattern shattered the hypothesis that Spinosaurus was simply an oversized variant of terrestrial predators, a local curiosity of the chem-chem ecosystem. If the aquatic signature had appeared only in chem-chem specimens, skeptics might have argued for local environmental variation, anomalous conditions unique to one river system. If only one chemical element had revealed the pattern, the finding might have been questioned as an artifact of methodology or interpretation, but calcium and oxygen told the same story. Morocco and Niger told the same story. Two predator lineages, occupying the same geographic regions across millions of years, maintained their chemical separation like a boundary written into their biology. The niche partitioning hypothesis, which proposed that multiple apex predators survived through dividing resources and space, now had chemical proof. Spinosaurus and its competitors were not competing for the same prey. They could not be, because the food chains that built their bodies were fundamentally different. Carcharodontosaurus fed on terrestrial herbivores and carried that history in its calcium and oxygen ratios. Spinosaurus fed on aquatic prey and carried a different history entirely. The chemical split between them was not a local anomaly, not a regional variation, not a single ecosystem's peculiarity. It was a consistent, reproducible, cross-continental pattern embedded in the mineral structure of their teeth, a signature that had survived intact across 95 million years of deep time. The chemistry pointed toward water. The isotopes screamed it. But chemistry alone cannot answer the most direct question: what did Spinosaurus actually eat? The answer arrives through the fossils themselves, through the preserved remains of prey animals locked in the same chem-chem beds alongside the predator's bones. Onchopristis numitis was a sawfish, though calling it that diminishes what it was. The animal reached lengths around 8 meters, which is about 26 feet, making it among the largest sawfish ever documented in the fossil record. Its most distinctive feature was the rostrum, a long, flattened projection extending from the front of its skull, lined along both edges with barbed denticles like the teeth of a saw. It was an aquatic predator itself, a hunter equipped with a biological tool specifically designed to slash through the bodies of smaller fish. Remains of Onchopristis appear abundantly throughout the chem-chem formation. The fossil record preserves them in numbers that speak to their ecological importance, their ubiquity in the ancient river system. And among those remains, something more remarkable appears. The rostral denticles of Onchopristis have been found in direct proximity to Spinosaurus fossils, not scattered vaguely nearby, but preserved in contexts suggesting association, physical connection, the kind of evidence paleontologists recognize as one of the most concrete dietary links in the entire assemblage. Mawsonia lived alongside Onchopristis in the same river channels. It was a coelacanth relative, a large lobe-finned fish descended from a lineage older than the dinosaurs themselves. Coelacanths are living fossils, their form unchanged for millions of years, and Mawsonia was among the giants of its kind, a substantial prey animal recovered repeatedly from the Chem deposits. The fossil record yields its bones and scales in sufficient numbers to confirm it as a major component of the aquatic fauna. These two fish species represent an enormous food supply. An 8-meter sawfish contains kilograms of protein, substantial nutrition for a large predator. A Mawsonia provides similar caloric return. More importantly, they lived in open river channels where water depths and currents defined their habitat. A Carcharodontosaurus hunting on land cannot access these animals. A terrestrial predator cannot pursue prey through deep water channels with speed or efficiency. A deltadromeus built for running on floodplains faces the same constraint. These fish were functionally inaccessible to every land-adapted predator in the ecosystem. They represent an enormous food supply with no terrestrial competition whatsoever. The water protected them from the teeth and claws of predators evolved to hunt on solid ground. Yet that protection meant nothing to a predator adapted to hunt in water. A creature that could catch Onchopristis and Mawsonia had secured a feeding niche unique in the Chem ecosystem. It had access to resources its competitors could not reach. The herbivores that Carcharodontosaurus hunted were finite, limited by population dynamics and availability. But the aquatic prey existed in abundance, renewable, sustainable, a food source that demanded a completely different approach to capture. Spinosaurus would need teeth designed not for slashing, but for gripping. It would need a skull shaped for detecting and catching prey that moved through water, that thrashed and fought against capture. It would need sensory organs attuned to aquatic hunting. The anatomy that held this answer was already forming in the stone, waiting to be read. Hold the skull of Spinosaurus, and the first impression arrives immediately. This is not a theropod skull arranged in theropod proportions. It is extraordinarily long and narrow, tapering toward the front like a needle drawn to a point. The overall shape resembles a large gharial far more closely than any dinosaur skull in the fossil record. A gharial is a modern crocodilian, a fish-eater of rivers and wetlands, and the parallel is not superficial. It is anatomical, it is functional, it is written into every dimension of the bone. The teeth bear no resemblance to Carcharodontosaurus, where that predator possessed thin, laterally flattened blades serrated along both edges. Spinosaurus carried conical teeth, smooth and pointed, built to pierce and grip rather than slice through tissue. The difference maps to different hunting strategies. A serrated blade cuts like a knife, opening wounds that cause rapid blood loss. A conical tooth drives deep like a spear, locking prey and preventing escape. One strategy kills through hemorrhage. The other holds prey immobilized long enough for the predator to move it, manipulate it, consume it. Two tools for two entirely different purposes. Along the snout, arranged in rows across the front of the jaw, are small pits called neurovascular foramina. They are structurally identical to the sensory pits found in modern crocodilians, organs of electroreception and mechanoreception that allow those animals to detect pressure waves and movement in water without relying on vision. A crocodile can hunt in murky water with its eyes closed because these pits translate the thrashing of prey into signals the brain can interpret. Spinosaurus possessed the same sensory architecture. It could detect movement through water that its eyes might not perceive. It could hunt in conditions where terrestrial predators would be blind and helpless. The nostrils are positioned further back on the skull than in any other known large theropod. Most dinosaurs carry their nostrils high and forward, positioned to breathe while the head remains elevated during bipedal locomotion. Spinosaurus's nostrils are retracted, shifted backward along the skull roof. This placement allowed the long snout to be submerged in water while the animal still breathed. A terrestrial predator cannot function with its nostrils underwater. A water predator can. The position announces the lifestyle. At the very tip of the jaw, where teeth meet at the front, lies the dental rosette. It is an interlocking cluster of forward-pointing teeth, tightly arranged, each one angled to prevent prey from slipping sideways out of the grip. This structure appears in fish-eating specialists across multiple lineages, in modern gharials, in extinct marine reptiles, in other fish-eating dinosaurs. It is not a random arrangement. It is a solution to a specific problem. When prey thrashes and fights inside a predator's mouth, when scales and mucus make it slippery, when the catch tries to escape sideways, a dental rosette holds it fast. Every element of this skull, taken individually, could suggest aquatic specialization. Taken together, they form something else entirely. A single integrated tool optimized completely for detecting, intercepting, and holding fast-moving aquatic prey. Nothing in the skull is optimized for a land hunt. Nothing suggests compromise between two modes of life. Spinosaurus did not inherit a generalist skull and adapt it to water. It evolved a skull that could only work in water, that only made sense in water, that announced through every structural detail what this animal had become. Place them side by side, and the difference is immediate. The Carcharodontosaurus skull is deep, built with vertical mass. Bone thickens at specific points where muscles anchor and where forces concentrate. The jaw closes with leverage, the kind that comes from depth, from a skull that can generate and absorb tremendous downward force. When those serrated teeth meet prey, they do so across a wide surface. The bite is not a point of contact but a line, a path of damage that opens flesh along its full length. The design is optimized for raw destructive power, for a bite that tears and wounds with each contact, bleeding the prey until shock or exsanguination brings it down. The prey must be large enough to require this force, substantial enough to warrant this investment of power. Spinosaurus offers something entirely different. The skull is long but shallow, stretched horizontally rather than built downward. This geometry trades bite force for something else: speed of closure. The jaw snaps forward with velocity that a deeper, more massive skull could never achieve. The conical teeth do not slice. They grip. They drive inward and lock, each tooth angled to prevent lateral escape. The jaw closure itself is narrow, designed for precision rather than for spreading force across a large prey body. A Spinosaurus bite targets a specific vulnerable point. It holds the catch immobilized long enough for the predator to manipulate it, to move it, to control it, despite its struggles and thrashing. These skulls are not variations on a common predator template. They are not different versions of the same solution applied to different sizes of prey. They are opposite solutions to opposite problems. Carcharodontosaurus solves the problem of how to kill large terrestrial herbivores through wounding and exhaustion. Spinosaurus solves the problem of how to catch and hold fast moving aquatic prey that fights and thrashes in water. The shapes announce the strategies, the proportions reveal the lives. Deep skull for a terrestrial ambush predator capable of delivering catastrophic wounds. Long skull for an aquatic pursuit predator capable of precision gripping. One kills through hemorrhage and physiological shock. One kills through immobilization and control. They could not be more different in their fundamental approach. This contrast requires no specialist knowledge to perceive. Isotope chemistry is invisible to the naked eye. Biomechanical modeling requires computation and expertise beyond most observers. But the skulls themselves are visible, tangible, comprehensible in their difference. A person standing before both fossils, without training, without background in paleontology, would recognize that these are not the same kind of animal. The shapes themselves announce two different lives. The proportions speak of different hunts, different prey, different worlds. The visual evidence stands alone, needing no translation. The narrative arc reaches a convergence point. The chemistry set it first, hidden inside fossilized enamel, the oxygen and calcium isotope ratios marking the two predators on different dietary pathways. The prey set it second, Onchopristis and Mawsonia accessible only to a predator that could enter the water, inaccessible to anything bound to land. Now the skull confirms it, visible in stone, unmistakable in its departure from theropod convention. Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus had divided this ecosystem between them along the waterline. One owned the ground, one owned the river. The two skulls, placed side by side, make that division physical, make it undeniable, make it permanent in stone. In 2018, an excavation team led by Nizar Ibrahim returned to the Kem beds of Morocco and recovered something that changed how paleontologists understood Spinosaurus. The specimen was more complete than any previously known, a skeleton that contained bones that had never been preserved together before. Among those bones were tail vertebrae, segments of the tail that no prior Spinosaurus fossil had ever yielded. The tail had existed in all the earlier specimens, certainly, but it had not survived the geological processes that turned living bone into stone. Now it was there, whole sections of it, vertebra after vertebra, announcing something that had remained unknown for a century. The neural spines running along the tail were the first striking feature. These are the bony projections that rise vertically from each vertebra, the structures that in most theropods form a modest ridge along the back and tail. In Spinosaurus, they were unusually elongated, significantly taller relative to vertebra size than in any other known theropod dinosaur. The comparison to other large meat-eaters makes the distinction clear. In Tyrannosaurus, the neural spines along the tail are proportionally modest, creating a tail profile that is long and relatively thin. In Allosaurus, the pattern repeats. These tails are built as counterbalances, structures that steady the animal during bipedal locomotion that offset the forward weight of a massive skull and muscular torso. They are stabilizers. They keep the animal upright. They are not propulsive structures. They do not push. Spinosaurus's tail was different. The neural spines rose from each vertebra to create a profile that was deep and blade-like, far from the thin tapering shape that characterizes typical theropod tails. The difference was not subtle. It was anatomically pronounced, visible immediately upon comparing the bones. A standard large theropod tail looks like a rod, long and cylindrical, designed through millions of years of evolution to solve the problem of balance during running. A Spinosaurus tail looked less like a dinosaur tail and more like a fin, a structure built to move through water rather than to steady an animal moving on land. The vertebrae themselves were the physical foundation of this shape. Each bone was modified to support the tall neural spines, creating a framework that could sustain significant lateral surface area. Skin stretched across this framework in life, turning the neural spines into a flat, expanded surface. The result was a paddle, a structure designed for a different purpose than anything that had come before it in the theropod lineage. A Spinosaurus could not have evolved this tail for running. A creature built for bipedal locomotion on land has no use for a tall, blade-like tail. The energy required to move such a structure sideways would be wasted motion, a liability in a sprint predator. The bones posed a question that demanded interpretation. What does a dinosaur do with a tail shaped like that? The answer was not hidden. It was written into the geometry of every vertebra, into the height of every neural spine, into the fundamental architecture of the thing. Spinosaurus had a tail built for undulation, for side-to-side movement, for pushing water. The specimen lying in the laboratory announced this through physical evidence that could not be reinterpreted or explained away. The tail had been there all along, hidden in the stone, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it. In 2020, a paper published in Nature presented an interpretation of what the tail actually did. Nizar Ibrahim and his research team had taken the recovered tail bones and subjected them to biomechanical analysis. They modeled the surface area, measuring the total expanse of the structure. They assessed flexibility, determining how much lateral movement the vertebrae and ligaments would allow. They calculated hydrodynamic properties, predicting how water would flow across the surfaces and what forces would result from movement through fluid. Then they compared the tail to known examples from living animals, examining the tails of creatures with established aquatic behaviors. The comparisons were striking. The Spinosaurus tail functioned similarly to the tail of a newt, an amphibian that uses undulation to propel itself through water. It resembled the tail of a crocodilian, built for the same side-to-side movement that allows modern crocodiles to accelerate through rivers. It matched the mechanics of certain aquatic lizards, reptiles that have evolved tails specifically for swimming. In each case, the locomotor mechanism was identical: lateral undulation. The tail moves side to side, pushes against the water, and transfers that force into forward motion. It is a swimming mechanism proven across multiple living lineages, now documented in a prehistoric animal through biomechanical reconstruction. The conclusion the team reached carried profound weight. The tail was capable of generating propulsive thrust through water. Spinosaurus could have used it to move itself forward in a fluid medium, to accelerate, to maneuver, to pursue prey through river channels. The tail was not a vestigial remnant, not a structure inherited from an ancestor and repurposed for something else. It was specialized for aquatic propulsion. If this interpretation was correct, Spinosaurus would be the only known non-avian dinosaur ever to have evolved a tail structure dedicated to aquatic swimming. No other dinosaur, in the entire fossil record, spanning hundreds of millions of years, had developed this adaptation. No other theropod, no sauropod, no ornithischian had taken this evolutionary path. Spinosaurus stood alone. This claim reached beyond the mechanics of swimming itself. An animal that evolved a swimming tail had committed substantial developmental resources to the water. Evolution does not invest in structures without purpose. A organism does not grow a specialized swimming tail, does not dedicate millions of years of evolutionary refinement to perfecting an aquatic propulsive device, simply to use it occasionally. An animal with this tail lived in water. It hunted in water. It relied on water for survival in ways that transcended opportunistic behavior. This was not an occasional visit to a river to drink. This was not a predator that hunted along shorelines and happened to wade into shallow water sometimes. This was a body built around the water as a primary environment. The tail announced it. The bones made it physical. The hydrodynamic analysis confirmed it. Spinosaurus had invested its evolutionary future in becoming something that could move through water with efficiency, with purpose, with the confidence of an animal for which that medium was home. The paper crystallized what the skeleton had been suggesting all along, transforming speculation into measurable analysis, ambiguity into clarity. Matteo Fabri and colleagues published a paper in 2022 that approached the aquatic question from an entirely different angle. They were not interested in tail function or skull morphology. They were examining bone itself, the material composition of the skeleton at the microscopic level. Specifically, they were measuring bone density, the mass of bone tissue packed into a given volume. This property reveals something fundamental about how an animal lived, what environment shaped it, what pressures determined its form. Pachyostosis is the technical term for what they were studying. It describes unusually dense, thickened bone tissue, the opposite of the lightweight, sometimes hollow bones that characterize most theropod dinosaurs. Modern birds are the living descendants of theropods, and they have evolved hollow bones to minimize weight for flight. Most dinosaurs carried this inheritance, bones designed for agility and speed and the demands of terrestrial predation. Spinosaurus departed from this pattern. Its bones were heavy. They were thickened. The question was why evolution would produce such a change. The methodology was straightforward and rigorous. The team obtained cross-sections of Spinosaurus limb bones and rib bones, cutting through them to examine the internal structure and density patterns. They compared these sections to cross-sections taken from a wide range of living and extinct animals with known lifestyles. Penguins appeared in the dataset, birds that dive deep and hunt underwater with precision. Hippopotamuses appeared, mammals that spend their lives submerged in rivers and lakes. Manatees appeared, marine mammals that browse underwater vegetation and move through aquatic environments with deliberate ease. The bone density values from Spinosaurus matched those from these aquatic specialists across multiple measurements. The functional logic was elegant and simple. A large, air-breathing animal is inherently buoyant. Its lungs are filled with air. Its body tissues contain gases and spaces that want to float upward. Without intervention, it rises toward the surface. In water, this creates a fundamental problem for a predator trying to hunt at depth. It cannot simply sink and stay submerged. It must expend muscular energy constantly, swimming downward, fighting against its own buoyancy, just to remain at the correct depth to hunt effectively. This energy expenditure is expensive. It reduces the efficiency of the hunt. It wastes resources that could be used for pursuit or capture. The solution is passive ballast. Dense bones counteract buoyancy without effort. Heavy bones solve the problem without requiring any active swimming effort just to stay down. The predator sinks, remains submerged, hunts from a position of mechanical advantage. Penguins use this strategy. Hippos use this strategy. Manatees use this strategy. Spinosaurus used this strategy. The study yielded an additional finding that would echo through later sections of this story. Suchomimus, a related African spinosaurid that lived millions of years before Spinosaurus, had measurably less dense bones than its larger relative. Suchomimus was not as heavily ballasted. Its bones were denser than a standard theropod, confirming aquatic adaptation, but less dense than Spinosaurus itself. The difference was quantifiable, measurable, embedded in the bone structure itself. A gradient appeared in the data, a progressive shift toward aquatic specialization. Spinosaurus sat at the extreme point of that continuum, the most completely adapted to water, the most reliant on dense bones to maintain depth. The bone density study documented this progression in physical form, making evolutionary trajectory visible in the very architecture of the skeleton. In 2022, a different research team published a different interpretation of the same evidence. Paul Sereno and colleagues at the University of Chicago approached Spinosaurus with equal scientific standing and deep prior expertise. Their work was not dismissive of aquatic adaptation. It was a direct challenge to the extent of that adaptation, a careful argument that the animal was something other than what the Ibrahim's studies proposed. Their method was sophisticated. They built a complete three-dimensional digital flesh model of Spinosaurus, using computed tomography scans of actual fossilized bones as their foundation. They added musculature, applying what is known about reptile anatomy to reconstruct the muscle groups that would have existed in life. They created a virtual animal with mass and proportions and mechanical properties derived from the actual skeleton. Then they tested this model's performance in water, running hydrodynamic simulations to see how it would move, how it would behave, whether it could accomplish the tasks that an aquatic predator must accomplish. The results diverged from the Ibrahim interpretation. The model moved at less than 1 meter per second at the water's surface. A walking person travels at roughly 1.4 meters per second. Spinosaurus, in Sereno's model, was slower than a human strolling along a riverbank. More troubling, the model could not generate the buoyancy control necessary to submerge and remain underwater. It wanted to float, it could not stay down. The mechanical problems were specific and measurable. The nostrils and eye sockets were positioned on the skull in a way that would require lifting the entire head clear of the water surface simply to breathe. A crocodile can remain mostly submerged, with only eyes and nostrils exposed above the waterline. Spinosaurus could not adopt this posture. The head would need to come up. The low-profile aquatic hunting strategy became impossible. An animal cannot hunt effectively if it must constantly expose itself by raising its head to breathe. The tall neural spine sail created a second problem. Running along the back and into the tail, this structure would have generated significant lateral drag and instability in water. Smooth, streamlined animals move efficiently through fluid. Structures that protrude create turbulence, create resistance, cause the animal to tip rather than track straight. The sail was a liability in water, not an asset. It would have interfered with the precision turning that an aquatic pursuit predator requires. The trunk itself presented a third mechanical constraint. It was too rigid. The tail, despite its blade-like appearance, was too lightly muscled for the sharp, powerful lateral flexions that aquatic pursuit predators use to change direction at speed. A crocodile can accelerate and turn in water because its trunk and tail are flexible enough to generate the forces necessary. Spinosaurus lacked this flexibility. The body plan did not support explosive aquatic maneuvers. Sereno's team concluded that Spinosaurus was best understood as a bipedal shoreline ambush predator. It waded at the river's edge and snatched prey from the shallows rather than actively swimming after it. The animal was aquatically adapted, certainly, but more in the manner of a wading bird than a pursuit swimmer. It lived near water. It hunted in water. but it did not swim through water the way Ibrahim's interpretation suggested. The evidence, they argued, pointed to a different ecology, a different life, a different understanding of what Spinosaurus had become. Science does not always resolve into certainty. Sometimes it resolves into productive disagreement, and the Spinosaurus debate exists in that space. The Ibrahim and Serrano teams arrived at different conclusions from the same fossil evidence, and both teams brought expertise and rigor to their interpretations. The disagreement is real. The difference in their conclusions matters, but what they agree on exceeds what divides them. Every research group involved accepts that Spinosaurus shows more aquatic skeletal adaptation than any other known dinosaur. This is not contested. The oxygen isotopes confirm aquatic life. The calcium isotopes confirm aquatic diet. The skull shape confirms aquatic hunting specialization. The bone density confirms aquatic ballasting. On these points, there is convergence. The disagreement centers on a single question of degree. How much of an aquatic animal was Spinosaurus? How far along the continuum from land to water had this lineage progressed? The Ibrahim interpretation proposes an active underwater pursuit predator, an animal that swam through river channels using its tail for propulsion, that hunted by pursuing prey through open water, that had committed substantially to an aquatic lifestyle. The Serrano interpretation proposes a shoreline ambush waiter, an animal that lived near water, that hunted in shallow margins, that used water as part of its ecology but not as its primary hunting medium. Two different readings of the same body, two different understandings of what the skeleton revealed. Both interpretations place Spinosaurus significantly toward the water, away from the terrestrial predator template that Carcharodontosaurus embodied. The distance between them measures the uncertainty in how aquatic this animal actually was, not whether it was aquatic at all. The debate has not concluded. New analyses appeared in 2024 and 2025, meaning this remains a live scientific question rather than a settled one. Paleontologists continue to examine the evidence, testing hypotheses, proposing new interpretations. The question of Spinosaurus's ecology sits at the frontier of active research, where certainty has not yet crystallized and multiple readings of the fossil record still coexist in scientific literature. This uncertainty can feel like weakness in a narrative that aims at clarity. It is not. It is a feature of the story rather than a flaw. What is not disputed across all research teams is that something extraordinary happened to Spinosaurus's body over millions of years of evolution. The skeleton departed from the theropod template in ways that remain visible in stone. The animal was built differently. The animal lived differently. The animal occupied a place in its ecosystem that no other large predator before or since has occupied. Whether it swam through rivers in active pursuit or waded in shoreline shallows becomes a question about the degree of that departure, not about the departure itself. The science is still catching up to understanding exactly how far this animal went along the journey toward water. The fossils announce the journey plainly. The bones show the commitment. The chemistry locks in the dietary signature. The debate between research teams reflects not the absence of evidence, but the complexity of interpreting evidence that spans 95 million years and survives only in fragmentary form. Spinosaurus moved toward water. How completely it made that transition remains an open question, one that science approaches with each new paper, each new analysis, each fresh examination of the stone. Spinosaurus did not appear in isolation. It emerged from a family with a history, a lineage that had been moving toward water for millions of years before Spinosaurus reached its most extreme form. To understand what Spinosaurus became, The story must step back and trace the Spinosaurid family as a whole, following the trajectory across time, watching the commitment to water deepen across generations of predators spanning continents and epochs. Baryonyx walkeri arrived in the fossil record in 1983, discovered in a clay pit in Surrey, England. It is one of the earliest and most completely preserved spinosaurids known, a skeleton that provided paleontologists with their first detailed look at what a spinosaur could be. The animal measured approximately 9 to 10 meters, which is about 30 to 33 feet in length. It possessed the characteristic elongated, narrow skull and conical teeth that define the Spinosaur family, the same hunting architecture that would appear in later relatives. The body shape announced its kinship to Spinosaurus, yet the hind limbs told a different story. They were proportioned more like a standard theropod, longer relative to body size, still capable of effective terrestrial locomotion. Baryonyx could move on land with competence and speed. It was not the short-limbed specialist that Spinosaurus would eventually become. The fossil itself contained something remarkable. Inside the rib cage of the Baryonyx holotype, paleontologists discovered fish scales from a large freshwater fish called lepidotes. This was not speculation derived from skull morphology. This was not inference drawn from tooth shape or skeletal proportion. This was physical, unambiguous proof of what the animal ate. Baryonyx consumed fish. It hunted them in rivers and streams. The dietary evidence was preserved in stone, a record of the last meal locked inside the skeleton, testimony spanning hundreds of millions of years. The bone density data from the Fabry 2022 study extended Baryonyx's aquatic profile further. The animal had relatively dense bones, denser than a typical theropod, suggesting that it too spent meaningful time submerged. Before bone density analysis became a standard tool in paleontology, researchers had classified Baryonyx as a fish eater that occasionally waded into water. The chemical evidence of the bones revealed more depth to this picture. Baryonyx was already committed to water in ways that earlier studies had not fully appreciated. It was more aquatic than the skeleton's terrestrial-looking limbs might have suggested to someone examining only shape and proportion. In the evolutionary narrative, Baryonyx occupies a singular position. It is not the endpoint of the story. It is not the full realization of what Spinosaurs could become. It is the beginning. A predator already fishing, a hunter already devoted to aquatic prey, a skeleton that shows the first clear steps down a path that would be followed further and further by the Spinosaurs that came after. Baryonyx established the trajectory. It demonstrated that a large theropod could successfully hunt fish, could develop the skull anatomy for precision gripping, could commit bones and body to water. The rest of the Spinosaurid family would follow this path that Baryonyx pioneered, each successive species moving further from land, each one more deeply invested in the aquatic world. Spinosaurus would eventually reach an extreme that Baryonyx never approached, but Spinosaurus did not invent the journey. It inherited the beginning and completed what Baryonyx had set in motion. Between Baryonyx and Spinosaurus stands Suchomimus tenerensis, excavated from the Tenere Desert of Niger and formally described in 1998. Geological time separates them by millions of years. Evolutionary distance places them at different points along the same trajectory. Suchomimus occupies the middle ground, a predator that shows how the Spinosaurid lineage was progressing toward water without yet reaching the extreme that Spinosaurus would eventually achieve. The skull of Suchomimus is recognizably similar to Spinosaurus, elongated and narrow, built for the precision of gripping aquatic prey. The overall build announces Spinosaurid kinship throughout. A modest neural spine sail runs along the back, a structure noticeably smaller than Spinosaurus's towering blade, but still present, still marking this animal as fundamentally different from standard theropods of the era. The limb proportions tell the story of transition in bone and muscle. They are slightly more terrestrially capable than the extreme short-legged form that Spinosaurus would display, yet they depart noticeably from the standard theropod template that baryonyx still retained. Suchomimus represents a middle stage, an animal moving toward aquatic specialization, but not yet fully committed to it in every aspect of its skeleton. The bone density data from Fabry 2022 placed Suchomimus in a specific ecological position within the family. It had measurably less dense bones than both baryonyx and Spinosaurus, positioning it in a shallower aquatic niche than either relative. The animal waded at the water's margin rather than submerging in deep pursuit of prey. It was more committed to water than a terrestrial predator would be, yet less ballasted for deep aquatic hunting than its larger relative would become. The bones themselves document the progression across the entire family. Each successive Spinosaur invested more heavily in dense ballast for underwater life. Each one sank deeper into water. Suchomimus occupied the middle tier of this gradient, denser than a land-hunting theropod would be, lighter than the fully aquatic Spinosaurus eventually became. Yet the calcium isotope values told a story that transcended bone density alone. Suchomimus carried a distinctly negative calcium isotope signature, the same signature that marked aquatic diet in Spinosaurus. Even without the deep water bone density of its largest relative, Suchomimus fed on aquatic prey. It hunted fish in rivers and streams. It consumed animals from food chains rooted in water rather than on terrestrial ground. The isotopes confirmed what the skull shape suggested and what the bones partly supported. This animal's diet came from the river systems of ancient Africa. The significance of Suchomimus's position deserves explicit statement in understanding the full arc. It is not the beginning of the aquatic trend in the Spinosaur lineage. Baryonyx established that beginning, the first clear evidence of a large theropod devoted to fishing. Suchomimus is not the endpoint. Spinosaurus would eventually reach an extreme that Suchomimus never approached, a commitment to water that transformed the entire body plan. Suchomimus stands between them as a measurable midpoint, a living record of a family in the middle of a transition that would not be complete until Spinosaurus emerged. It is a snapshot of evolution in progress, a moment when the Spinosaur lineage had moved significantly toward water, but still maintained the flexibility to exist on land. The gradient becomes visible through Suchomimus. The journey that baryonyx began reaches toward the destination Spinosaurus would ultimately occupy. Now that all three animals have been introduced, the evolutionary gradient becomes visible as a single, measurable sequence. Baryonyx occupies the first position. Its diet is confirmed by direct fossil evidence, fish scales preserved inside its ribcage. Its bones show moderate density, denser than a typical theropod, but lighter than what would come later. Its limbs are proportioned to allow effective terrestrial locomotion. Baryonyx is already fishing, already partially committed to water, yet still capable of moving competently on land. It is the beginning. Suchomimus occupies the middle position. Its diet is confirmed through isotope chemistry, the calcium and oxygen signatures pointing toward aquatic prey. Its bones are measurably less dense than baryonyx's, placing it in a shallower ecological niche, wading at the water's margin rather than diving deep. Its skull resembles Spinosaurus more closely than baryonyx's, the progression toward elongation becoming visible. Its limbs show the continued movement away from terrestrial capability, though not yet reaching the extreme reduction that Spinosaurus displays. Suchomimus is the middle ground, the transition in progress. Spinosaurus occupies the final position. Its sustained aquatic life is confirmed through multiple independent lines of evidence. Oxygen isotopes lock in a signature of deep, regular contact with fresh water. Calcium isotopes confirm an aquatic food chain. The skull is elongated beyond anything Suchomimus approached, built entirely for aquatic prey capture. The tail is transformed into a propulsive paddle, a structure unique in the dinosaur record. The bones are the densest of all three, ballasted for underwater life. Spinosaurus represents the destination point that the family's trajectory was moving toward. What makes this gradient remarkable is that multiple independent datasets move in the same direction simultaneously. Bone density increases progressively across the three animals. Skull elongation increases progressively. Limb proportions shift progressively away from terrestrial optimization. Isotope chemistry shifts progressively toward aquatic signatures. No single measurement stands alone. Each dataset independently confirms the same biological story. Three animals positioned at different points along a continuous spectrum of aquatic adaptation. The timescale spanning this transformation deserves explicit acknowledgement. Spinosaurids first appear in the fossil record of early Cretaceous Europe, roughly 130 million years ago. Baryonyx represents this early form, the beginning of the aquatic journey. The full Spinosaurus form appears roughly 95 to 100 million years ago. The transition unfolded across approximately 30 to 35 million years of geological time, a span longer than the entire history of human civilization extended backward. Evolution was writing this story slowly, across epochs, gradually reshaping the Spinosaur body with each generation. The geographic spread reveals how thoroughly this trajectory shaped the entire family. Spinosaurid fossils have been confirmed in England, France, Spain, Niger, Morocco, Egypt, Brazil, and possibly Portugal, a lineage spreading across multiple continents, occupying diverse river systems from tropical to subtropical latitudes. Despite this geographic dispersal, the aquatic trajectory remained consistent. Whether in European clay pits or African deserts or South American formations, the spinosaurs were moving toward water. The commitment to aquatic life was not a local phenomenon unique to one region. It was a family-wide trajectory, encoded in lineage after lineage across vast stretches of the ancient world. Return now to the Chem-Chem ecosystem with the full evolutionary history of the Spinosaurid lineage assembled. The pieces fit together into a coherent story. By the time Spinosaurus reached its maximum size and its most extreme aquatic adaptations, it arrived in a world already claimed. Carcharodontosaurus owned the terrestrial hunting niche. Deltadromeus occupied the mid-sized predator role on land. Both animals were better suited to terrestrial pursuit than Spinosaurus could ever be with its short-legged body plan. The ground belonged to them. Their anatomies were optimized for running, for sprinting, for the explosive acceleration that hunting on land demands. Spinosaurus possessed neither the speed of Deltadromeus nor the raw power of Carcharodontosaurus. On land, it would always lose. Competitive exclusion is the mechanism that paleontologists use to describe what happens when two species compete directly for the same resource in the same space. The better adapted competitor wins. The weaker one is eliminated through starvation, through failure to reproduce, through slow erosion across generations. It is not dramatic. It is arithmetic. One animal survives. one does not. The way to avoid elimination is to stop competing for the same resource. Find something else. Claim a niche that others cannot access. Natural selection in a crowded ecosystem consistently favors individuals that exploit underused resources. In the Chem, one resource remained underexploited. The river was filled with fish. Onchopristis and Mawsonia and countless smaller species lived in the channels, fed in the water, moved through depths that no land-adapted predator could access. Every predator on land was specialized for terrestrial prey, optimized for capturing animals that moved across solid ground. The aquatic prey represented an enormous food supply with no competition. A predator that could access it would have an entire niche to itself. The evolutionary consequence follows from this logic. Spinosaurus did not possess a body plan suited to winning terrestrial competition. Natural selection could have pursued a different path, could have produced a faster version of Spinosaurus, a competitor optimized to outrun Deltadromeus or overpower Carcharodontosaurus. That path led to starvation. Instead, selection favored individuals that moved toward water, longer skulls for gripping fish, denser bones for maintaining depth, short hind limbs that mattered less when the predator could hunt in water. Over millions of years, the lineage that baryonyx began followed this trajectory deeper and deeper until Spinosaurus emerged as something completely transformed. There is a quiet irony in what the Chem ecosystem produced. The fossil record suggests that this was the most overcrowded, most dangerous predator ecosystem in the entire Cretaceous. 4 apex predators in one river system, all massive, all hunting, all competing for survival in an impossible space. The arithmetic should have collapsed. The ecosystem should have fractured. Instead, it produced something that the dinosaur world had never seen before and would never see again. The most anatomically unusual predator in the entire dinosaur family tree emerged from this pressure. Spinosaurus did not become great by dominating the terrestrial world. It became extraordinary by leaving it, by exploiting an underused niche with such complete commitment that it transformed its entire skeleton in the process. The sail is the detail that complicates the story, the anatomical feature that resists easy classification. A row of elongated neural spines runs along the back of Spinosaurus and possibly extends into the tail. Individual spine height in some specimens reaches up to 1.65 meters, which is about 5.4 feet, towering structures covered in skin during life. This covering formed a large, continuous surface structure, a sail that rose from the animal's body and caught the light and air. The function of the sail remains genuinely unresolved. Paleontologists have proposed explanations rooted in thermoregulation, the increased surface area potentially allowing faster heat absorption or dissipation in tropical environments. Others suggest visual display, a structure used for species recognition or for attracting mates, a signal broadcasted across the river landscape. Some propose energy or fat storage, a biological hump similar to what a bison carries, a reservoir of reserves that could sustain the animal through lean times. The sail may have served multiple functions simultaneously, layering purposes into a single anatomical structure. The truth remains uncertain. The sail creates a specific mechanical problem for the aquatic hypothesis. Sereno's modeling team identified it as a source of drag and lateral instability in water. A structure that protrudes from the body creates resistance as water flows around it. The tall sail would generate turbulence, would cause the animal to tip rather than track straight through the water. An underwater pursuit predator benefits from a streamlined profile, smooth and hydrodynamic. The sail works against this. It would hinder the precision turning and rapid acceleration that an effective aquatic hunter requires. Yet the counter observation complicates the objection. Crocodilians possess dorsal ridges that run along their backs. Some aquatic lizards carry comparable structures. Both groups function effectively in water, despite these protrusions. A sail alone does not rule out aquatic activity. The presence of dorsal structures does not prevent an animal from being an accomplished swimmer. Spinosaurus could have maintained aquatic behaviors even with the drag and instability that the sail would create. The cost would have been measurable, but perhaps manageable. The sail represents something deeper than a simple mechanical problem. It is the one anatomical feature that does not map cleanly onto either category, neither full terrestrial predator nor full aquatic specialist. A terrestrial predator would benefit from minimal dorsal structures. An aquatic predator would benefit from streamlining. The sail serves neither purpose efficiently. It is a structure inherited from an ancestral body plan, a relic of a time when Spinosaurus's ancestors evolved this feature for reasons lost to deep time. Spinosaurus carried the sail forward into a world it was in the process of leaving, a world where water was becoming primary. The sail persisted through the transformation, unchanged in its basic form even as the rest of the body reorganized around aquatic life. The sail stands as testimony to evolution's constraints. Organisms do not rebuild from scratch. They inherit the skeletons of their ancestors and modify them within limits. Spinosaurus could not shed the sail that previous generations of spinosaurs had evolved. It could only carry it into new environments, accept it as a liability, and continue moving toward the water despite the drag it created. The sail is the compromise that every transitional form must make, the feature that reveals an animal caught between two worlds. In 2014, a paper published in Science introduced the full picture of Spinosaurus to the paleontology community for the first time. Nizar Ibrahim's team had assembled enough fossil material to produce the first complete body outline based on actual remains rather than extrapolation from partial skeletons. What the reconstruction revealed stopped the paleontology community in its tracks. This was not a standard theropod arranged in familiar proportions. This was something fundamentally different from anything the dinosaur record had produced before. The anatomical departures announced themselves throughout the skeleton with unmistakable clarity. The hind limbs were shorter relative to body length than in any comparable theropod, a proportion that suggested reduced terrestrial locomotor efficiency from the outset. The feet were wide and flat, possibly adapted to soft, wet substrate, structures that would have provided purchase in mud and sand and waterlogged ground. The pelvis and hip structure showed modifications that compromised bipedal running capability. The center of mass was positioned forward of where it sits in cursorial bipeds, shifted toward a posture optimized for horizontal trunk orientation rather than upright sprint stance. The reconstruction generated immediate controversy, particularly regarding how Spinosaurus moved when it ventured onto land. Ibrahim's team proposed that on land, Spinosaurus may have moved partly on all fours, a stance unlike any other large theropod known to science. Theropods are fundamentally defined by bipedal locomotion. The entire evolutionary history of the group rests on upright, two-legged movement. A large theropod that could move on all four limbs challenged foundational assumptions about what a theropod actually is. The proposal sparked intense debate within paleontology. Some researchers embraced it as a logical response to the anatomy. Others rejected it vigorously as a violation of theropod principles. The quadrupedal hypothesis became one of the most disputed aspects of the entire reconstruction. In 2022, Sereno's team weighed in with their own digital modeling based on computed tomography scans. Their three-dimensional analysis indicated that Spinosaurus remained bipedal on land, not quadrupedal. The animal could balance on two hind legs, could walk upright, could maintain a theropod posture even if awkwardly. However, Sereno's model still showed that on land, Spinosaurus was slow. It was not competitive as a terrestrial pursuit predator at any conceivable body size. The quadrupedal debate remained unresolved, but the fundamental ecological truth persisted, unchanged. Spinosaurus was not built for dominating terrestrial ecosystems. The disagreement between the teams on bipedal versus quadrupedal locomotion is scientifically significant and will likely continue. It reflects genuine uncertainty about how this animal actually moved, how it held its body, what postures it adopted during terrestrial activity. The debate will continue as new evidence emerges, as researchers refine their analyses, as fossils reveal additional details. Yet beneath this debate lies a point of complete agreement between all research teams. Spinosaurus on land was not the dominant animal in its ecosystem. Whether it moved on two legs or four, whether it waded or walked, or some combination of movement strategies, the fundamental ecological position remains unchanged. Spinosaurus was outcompeted on land by animals better suited to terrestrial predation. The water remained its true domain, the place where its anatomy made complete biological sense, the environment where no competitor could follow. 6 independent lines of evidence converge on a single conclusion, and in paleontology, such convergence approaches certainty. Each line emerged from different research teams, different methodologies, different questions asked of the fossil record. Yet they all point in the same direction, toward the same animal, toward the same life. Oxygen isotope chemistry from fossilized tooth enamel places Spinosaurus in sustained contact with fresh water. The ratios locked inside the mineral structure reveal an animal that spent substantial time submerged, far beyond what an occasional river visit would produce. Every other large predator in the chem-chem assemblage shows different values, values consistent with terrestrial life. Spinosaurus stands alone in the isotopic signature it carries. Calcium isotope chemistry from fossilized tooth enamel places Spinosaurus on an aquatic food chain. This second chemical element, measured through a completely different biological mechanism, confirms the first. The finding appears consistently across 2 separate fossil sites on different parts of the African continent, in Morocco and Niger. The geographic separation rules out local anomaly. The pattern is reproduced, independent, and reliable. Skull morphology announces the story visually. The bones themselves are long and narrow, crocodile-shaped, built entirely for catching aquatic prey. Conical teeth designed for gripping rather than slicing. Sensory pits arranged across the snout, structurally identical to the organs modern crocodilians use to detect movement in water. Nostrils positioned further back than in any other large theropod, allowing the long snout to submerge while the animal still breathes. Every element optimized for a life in rivers. Tail structure from the 2018 specimens reveals a paddle-shaped, propulsive surface, unlike any other known theropod tail. The neural spines are tall and blade-like, forming a structure capable of generating thrust through lateral undulation. Biomechanical analysis demonstrates that this tail could move water, could propel an animal forward, could function as a swimming mechanism. No other dinosaur in the entire fossil record possessed such a structure. Bone density from the Fabry 2022 study shows that Spinosaurus carried dense, heavy bones, matching the ballast bone pattern of penguins, hippos, and manatees. These are animals that rely on weight to maintain depth underwater, animals that exploit water as a primary habitat. The bone density is not coincidental. It serves a function. It solves a specific problem that only arises in aquatic life. Evolutionary family history traces a measurable gradient across the Spinosaurid lineage. Baryonyx begins the trajectory with fish scales in its ribcage and moderately dense bones. Suchomimus occupies the middle position with aquatic isotope signatures and intermediate bone density. Spinosaurus represents the endpoint, the most extreme commitment to water, the fullest expression of the trajectory that the family had been following for millions of years. Each species shows progressively greater anatomical commitment to water across 30 to 35 million years of evolutionary time. 6 independent lines of evidence: oxygen isotopes, calcium isotopes, skull morphology, tail structure, bone density, evolutionary gradient. Each could stand alone as suggestive. Together, they form a case that approaches what paleontology recognizes as certainty. This convergence is not coincidence. In the fossil record, when multiple independent datasets move in the same direction simultaneously, when different research teams using different methods arrive at the same conclusion, the case becomes as strong as deep time allows. Spinosaurus was built for water. Spinosaurus hunted in water. Spinosaurus lived in water. The stone itself bears witness. For an apex predator to transition from land to water is extraordinarily rare in the entire fossil record of vertebrate life. The event requires millions of years of gradual transformation, requires populations to survive through intermediate forms, requires selection pressure strong enough to reshape an entire body plan through countless generations. It has happened only a handful of times across the span of geological history. The ancestors of modern whales offer the most famous example of this transition. Pachycetids were small, four-legged land mammals that entered shallow coastal waters roughly 50 million years ago. Over the course of 15 million years of evolutionary time, their descendants became progressively more aquatic, more dependent on water, more modified by selection pressure for aquatic life. The transition unfolded slowly across epochs. The intermediate forms were real animals that lived real lives, filling ecological roles as they gradually changed. Eventually, after millions of years of continuous transformation, what emerged was a fully aquatic cetacean, an animal so completely transformed that early naturalists could not even recognize it as a mammal. Seals and sea lions followed a comparable path, returning to the ocean from a terrestrial, mustelid-like ancestor that walked on land. Their lineage passed through a transitional phase that lasted millions of years, producing animals that were neither fully terrestrial nor fully aquatic, but something genuinely in between. Crocodilians passed through even longer transitions across hundreds of millions of years, their entire lineage cycling between fully terrestrial and fully aquatic phases multiple times throughout their history. What all of these transitions share is fundamental and unambiguous. They are slow. They take millions of years to unfold. They produce animals that eventually become almost unrecognizable compared to their terrestrial ancestors. The transformation is not instantaneous or rapid. It is gradual and incremental, written into generation after generation of small anatomical changes that accumulate imperceptibly across deep time. Spinosaurus occupies a singular position within this historical context of vertebrate evolution. It is the only known dinosaur to have made meaningful anatomical progress along a comparable trajectory toward water. No other theropod moved in this direction. No other dinosaur committed its skeleton to aquatic life. Spinosaurus accomplished this transformation while remaining enormous, while remaining a predator, while remaining in direct competition with other large theropods in the same ecosystem. The transition was not happening in isolation or safety. It was occurring within an impossible predator ecosystem under pressure from competitors that shaped every aspect of the anatomical transformation. The implication is direct and unavoidable. Spinosaurus was not a finished product. It was a transition in progress, caught by the fossil record at a point somewhere between two worlds. The adaptation to water was incomplete when the Cretaceous ended. The process had not finished. Millions of additional years might have produced a fully aquatic dinosaur, a creature completely committed to water in ways that Spinosaurus could not yet achieve. But the fossil record stopped the clock. Environmental disruption and extinction events of 95 million years ago disrupted the Chem-Chem ecosystem. The pressure that had driven the Spinosaur lineage toward water ceased. The transition halted permanently. What remained was Spinosaurus, an animal partway through transformation, suspended in evolutionary transition. The Chem-Chem ecosystem did not persist indefinitely into deep time. By the end of the Cenomanian stage, roughly 93 to 94 million years ago, significant environmental changes began reshaping the North African landscape with inexorable force. Sea level rose across the continent. Habitats fragmented into disconnected patches. The faunal composition that had characterized the river system shifted under pressure from forces larger than any single predator could influence or resist. The world that had produced Spinosaurus and sustained its impossible predator guild was disappearing beneath changing climates and rising waters. Spinosaurus's last known occurrences date to this period of environmental upheaval and transformation. The animal did not survive to the end Cretaceous extinction event, that catastrophic moment 66 million years ago, when an asteroid struck and ended the dinosaur age entirely. Rather, Spinosaurus vanished during an earlier regional disruption when the Chem-Chem world itself was being remade by climate shifts and hydrological changes and the slow reshaping of continents. The fossil record stops yielding Spinosaurus remains after this point. The animal disappears from the stone, leaving only the bones that preserve its existence and reveal its anatomy to distant observers millions of years hence. Carcharodontosaurus also disappears from the record at roughly this same time, in the same geological moment. The predator that had dominated terrestrial hunting in the Chem-Chem ecosystem, that had held the ground with power while Spinosaurus claimed the water with specialization, also fell silent in the fossil record. Both animals vanished together in the geological record. Both succumbed to the same environmental shift that ended the ecosystem they had shared for millions of years. The entire predator guild that had seemed so impossibly configured dissolved under pressure from forces beyond individual adaptation. The system that had sustained four massive apex predators in what should have been an ecologically unstable space finally collapsed. There is a quiet irony embedded in how the story of these two predators concludes. They had divided an impossible ecosystem between them along the waterline, each occupying a niche the other could not access, each exploiting resources the other could not reach. They had not destroyed each other through direct conflict. Neither had outcompeted the animal it opposed through superior fitness or better adaptation. Instead, they were ended by something neither could control or resist or adapt to quickly enough. The environmental changes that reshaped the chem came from forces operating on scales and timescales beyond the reach of evolution, beyond the reach of any individual animal's capacity to respond. The competition between Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus was made permanent by extinction rather than resolved by triumph or dominance. One did not eliminate the other through predation or starvation or slow displacement over generations. Instead, both fell to the same tide of environmental change that swept across North Africa. The system they had adapted to so completely, the ecosystem that had been pressured into an impossible configuration by their presence, finally gave way to forces that neither could withstand. The predators that had committed their entire bodies to life in that specific system could not survive its ending. Spinosaurus with its water-bound anatomy, Carcharodontosaurus with its terrestrial specializations. Both were locked into an ecological arrangement that could only exist in one place, in one narrow set of circumstances. When those circumstances changed irrevocably, both disappeared from the record together. A single concrete measurement reframes everything about what Spinosaurus actually was, a number that has not been directly stated until this moment. The largest confirmed individual Spinosaurus specimens suggest a body mass somewhere between 7 and 20 metric tons, depending on which reconstruction model paleontologists employ in their analysis. The range reflects genuine ongoing uncertainty about exactly how heavy the animal was, but even the lower bound already exceeds the mass of most known theropods from any era, 7 metric tons minimum. 20 metric tons at the upper end of the estimates. This is the scale of the animal. To comprehend this mass with clarity, comparison to modern animals becomes necessary and instructive. At 7 metric tons minimum, Spinosaurus outweighed a fully grown African elephant by a substantial margin. An adult African elephant, one of the heaviest land animals alive in the modern world, typically weighs between 4 and 7 metric tons. Spinosaurus, at its smallest confirmed estimate, surpassed even the heaviest elephants by a considerable amount. At the upper end of estimates, approaching 20 metric tons, Spinosaurus approached the combined mass of two full-sized African elephants standing together on the same ground. The scale becomes incomprehensible. An animal of this mass cannot be casual about the physics of its environment. The heat was intense in the Kem River system. The climate was tropical, the air thick with moisture, the sun relentless across the landscape. A land animal of this size generates tremendous metabolic heat simply through the process of living, through the chemical processes that keep tissues alive and muscles functioning. Thermoregulation becomes a serious physiological problem at this scale. The animal must dissipate heat or suffer the consequences of overheating, of cellular damage, of death. In such an environment, surrounded by water and river channels, the solution becomes obvious and unavoidable. The water was not incidental to this animal's life. A creature this heavy, in this heat, with this particular body plan, needed the buoyancy the water provided, needed the cooling effect of immersion, needed access to a thermal refuge that land simply could not offer. The implications extend well beyond feeding ecology, well beyond the hunt for fish and the exploitation of aquatic prey. The water may not have been only about acquiring food, though that was certainly part of the answer. It may have been about the fundamental physics of being this large in this environment at all. Spinosaurus did not move toward water, only to exploit an underused food resource. It moved toward water because the terrestrial world was becoming a place where an animal of this mass could not exist comfortably or sustainably. The legs were short, yes, but they were also short because supporting 20 metric tons on land required anatomical compromises that made running impossible anyway. The bones were dense, yes, for ballast and water, but also because a creature this massive needed every advantage to reduce the strain on its skeleton under the relentless pull of gravity. The Kem River system was not merely a feeding ground for Spinosaurus. It was a refuge, a place where the laws of physics and thermodynamics worked in the animal's favor rather than against it. The water held the weight that land could not support. The water dissipated heat that land could only accumulate. The water provided everything that an animal of Spinosaurus's scale required to survive in an equatorial environment. Now that every piece of evidence has been assembled and laid into place, the reconstruction of Spinosaurus becomes complete. The full picture emerges from the convergence of chemistry, anatomy, paleontology, and evolutionary history. Spinosaurus was the longest predatory animal ever to exist on land. No other confirmed theropod matched its length. No other dinosaur extended to 15 meters, which is about 49 feet, of predatory body. At this scale, terrestrial agility became genuinely difficult, regardless of how the limbs were proportioned. A creature of this length, operating at this mass, could not have moved with the speed necessary for effective terrestrial hunting, even if the skeleton had been designed for running. It lived in an ecosystem that was already fully occupied on land by competitors better adapted for terrestrial hunting than Spinosaurus could ever be. Carcharodontosaurus held the ground. Deltadromeus occupied the mid-tier hunting niche. Both animals were built for speed, for pursuit, for the explosive acceleration that running on solid ground demands. Spinosaurus could not compete in their world. The terrestrial predator guild had no room for an animal built as Spinosaurus was built. Its lineage had been moving toward water for tens of millions of years before Spinosaurus arrived at its most extreme form. Baryonyx established the trajectory, already fishing, already partially adapted to aquatic life. Suchomimus occupied the middle ground, more aquatic than Baryonyx, but less extreme than Spinosaurus would become. Each species showed progressive commitment to water, written into bone density, skull shape, limb proportions, and chemical signatures. The Spinosaur family had chosen a path, and Spinosaurus represented the full expression of that choice. Its bones announced the aquatic life. Dense bones matched the ballast pattern of penguins and hippos and manatees. Its teeth declared the hunting method, conical and smooth, built for gripping rather than slicing. Its skull proclaimed the sensory world. Long and narrow, crocodile-shaped, lined with sensory pits that detected movement in water, its tail revealed the propulsive mechanism. Blade-like neural spines forming a paddle that could generate thrust through lateral undulation. The chemistry locked inside its fossilized enamel spoke in the language of isotopes. Oxygen and calcium ratios placing Spinosaurus on aquatic food chains in sustained contact with fresh water, far removed from the terrestrial signatures of its competitors. All of this pointed in the same direction. Every line of evidence converged. The water was not a refuge or a fallback option adopted in desperation when the animal could not compete on land. The water was the end point of a trajectory that the entire Spinosaurid family had been following across millions of years of geological time. The family did not stumble into aquatic adaptation by accident. It moved deliberately, if unconsciously, through the mechanism of natural selection toward a world that offered opportunity instead of competition. Spinosaurus did not abandon land for water out of desperation. It completed a journey its family had already begun, in a world that gave it every reason to finish what evolution had started. The ecosystem that had become impossible on land welcomed it in the river. The prey that no land adapted predator could reach became accessible. The water that would have been a refuge for a terrestrial animal became home for Spinosaurus, a medium perfectly suited to a creature that had invested its entire skeleton in its occupation. Reframe the entire story now, from the perspective of what Spinosaurus actually became as a result of millions of years of evolutionary trajectory. What emerged was a creature with no precedent in the dinosaur record before it. No theropod had ever moved toward water in this way. No dinosaur had ever committed its skeleton to aquatic life. Spinosaurus represented something genuinely new in the history of the lineage. Yet, what it became also had no successor. The Spinosaurid lineage ended without producing a fully aquatic descendant. The transition was interrupted before it could complete. This absence of successors marks something genuinely unusual in the broader history of life. Most major land-to-water transitions in vertebrate evolution eventually produced fully aquatic lineages that persisted and diversified. The Pachycetids became whales, creatures so transformed that they bear no obvious resemblance to their terrestrial ancestors. The turtles that once walked on land became sea turtles, their shells and flippers optimized for ocean life, their lineage thriving in aquatic environments across millions of years. Even crocodilians, though they cycled between aquatic and terrestrial phases across their vast evolutionary history, maintained viable populations in both worlds. Successful transitions produce survivors, lineages that continue, species that speciate and diversify and fill the ecological spaces their new environment offers. Spinosaurus's lineage did not reach that endpoint. The transition did not complete. The spinosaurs did not become fully aquatic dinosaurs that would speciate and diversify and eventually be preserved in the fossil record as a thriving aquatic clade. Instead, the lineage exists in the fossil record as the furthest point a dinosaur ever reached on the journey from land to water. Spinosaurus marks a high water mark that was never surpassed, a maximum commitment to aquatic life that no other dinosaur ever approached, a transition interrupted before it could become irreversible. The dinosaurs never produced a whale. They never evolved a creature fully dependent on water in the way that cetaceans are dependent on ocean. Spinosaurus came closer than any other theropod to making that leap, and then the moment passed. The extinction events that reshaped the Chem-Chem ecosystem roughly 93 to 94 million years ago ended the possibility. Environmental changes disrupted the river system that had supported both Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus. Both predators vanished from the fossil record at approximately the same time. The pressure that had driven the Spinosaur lineage toward water ceased. The ecosystem that had become impossible on land and had therefore rewarded aquatic specialization collapsed. The transition stalled. The momentum that had carried the Spinosaurs from Baryonyx through Suchomimus to Spinosaurus stopped. The lineage died. The story ended. What remains is Spinosaurus itself, frozen in the fossil record at a particular moment in an evolutionary journey that would never be completed. The largest predator on Earth, mid-transition, caught by extinction before the adaptation to water could become total, before the commitment could become irreversible, before the journey could reach its destination. The animal was still trapped between two worlds at the moment the world changed too drastically for it to survive. Neither fully of the land nor fully of the water, it could not adapt to the shifting conditions that followed. The fossil record preserves it at that moment, partway through becoming something unprecedented, something that the world would never allow to finish its transformation. Reframe the story's central tension one final time. This was not a predator that failed on land and retreated in defeat. Spinosaurus did not lose a competition. It could not win and then slink away to lick its wounds in the river. This was a predator that faced a specific, measurable competitive pressure and moved in the direction that pressure pointed. The pressure came from Carcharodontosaurus and Deltadromeus, from competitors better suited to terrestrial hunting, from an ecosystem already fully occupied by animals, optimized for running and pursuing and subduing prey on solid ground. Spinosaurus moved toward water. The water was the direction no one else had claimed. The particular quality of that movement deserves emphasis. It did not produce a winner in the traditional sense. Spinosaurus did not outcompete its rivals. It did not drive them from the ecosystem or establish dominance through superior strength or speed. Instead, it produced something new, an animal that had never existed before the pressure created it. The Spinosaur lineage, moving progressively toward water across millions of years, eventually yielded a creature built entirely for a different world. Spinosaurus represented novelty, not triumph. It was an answer to an impossible situation, a solution forged by natural selection working across countless generations. What Spinosaurus's existence demonstrates about the logic of survival under competition extends far beyond this single animal. When an environment is already occupied by something better suited to it, the most durable response is not to fight harder in the same direction. The mathematics of competition are ruthless. A smaller, slower predator cannot defeat a larger, faster one in a direct contest for the same resources. The solution is not to become slightly better at what the competitor already dominates. The solution is to find the direction no one else has taken. This logic is not unique to Spinosaurus. It appears throughout the history of life, at every scale, in every era, in every ecosystem. Early mammals survived the age of dinosaurs, not by competing directly with the dominant reptiles, but by exploiting ecological spaces the dinosaurs could not access. Nocturnal habits, small body size, specialized diets. The ancestors of modern birds survived the end Cretaceous extinction not through superior power, but through adaptations that placed them in niches the extinction event could not fully close. Fish first colonized land during the Devonian by moving into ecological spaces that terrestrial competitors had not yet claimed. The pattern repeats across the deep history of life. Spinosaurus made this logic visible in a way that few other fossils do. The pressure is written into the fossil record. The trajectory is measurable across three related animals spanning millions of years. The result is preserved in bone and tooth and chemical signature. The entire story can be read directly from the stone. Baryonyx shows the beginning, a predator already fishing, already partially adapted to water. Suchomimus occupies the middle, more aquatic than its ancestor but not yet as extreme as what would come next. Spinosaurus represents the endpoint, the full expression of the trajectory. The pressure is visible. The response is visible. The success is visible. Few evolutionary transitions preserve their logic so completely in the fossil record. Few stories of competition and adaptation can be read so directly from the bones themselves. Widen the lens now to see the pattern itself. Niche partitioning stands as one of the oldest and most reliable solutions in the entire history of life. The strategy appears across epochs and ecosystems and scales of biological organization. It is not unique to Spinosaurus. It is not even unique to dinosaurs. It is the fundamental principle that allows life to diversify and persist in the face of competition. Early mammals survived the age of dinosaurs by occupying ecological spaces the dominant reptiles could not access. They were small. They were active at night, moving through darkness when the massive dinosaurs could not hunt effectively. They filled dietary niches, exploiting insects and seeds and small vertebrates that the giant herbivores and carnivores overlooked. The dinosaurs dominated the day. The mammals owned the night. Both survived together by refusing to compete directly for the same resources. The first fish to colonize land during the Devonian encountered a terrestrial world with almost no competition. The land was empty of large predators, empty of established ecosystems, empty of creatures adapted to exploit the abundant resources that terrestrial environments offered. Those fish diversified explosively, producing the tetrapods that would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. They did not evolve by becoming better fish. They evolved by moving into a completely different direction, by exploiting a space no one else had claimed. The ancestors of modern birds survived the end Cretaceous extinction while all other dinosaurs were lost. They persisted partly because their small size and flight capability placed them in an ecological niche the extinction event could not fully close. The catastrophe that destroyed the large terrestrial predators and the giants of the ecosystem left spaces for creatures that could exploit resources the vanished animals had controlled. Birds moved into those spaces. They survived. The rest of the dinosaurs did not. The pattern is consistent across deep time. Life does not always win by being stronger in the same direction as the competition. Vertebrates did not conquer the land by becoming better swimmers. They conquered it by becoming something fundamentally new, by moving sideways into an unexploited direction. Life wins by choosing a different direction entirely when the current one is already occupied by something better suited to dominate it. Spinosaurus is one of the most complete illustrations of this principle in the entire fossil record. The pressure is visible. Carcharodontosaurus and Deltadromeus were better at terrestrial hunting. Spinosaurus was larger but slower, less agile, less competitive on ground. The response is visible. The Spinosaur lineage moved toward water across millions of years, each generation slightly more committed to aquatic life. The anatomical result is visible. Spinosaurus emerged with bones and teeth and skull and tail, all optimized for a completely different world. The pressure, the response, and the result can all be directly measured in the stone. Few evolutionary transitions preserve their logic so completely. Baryonyx shows the beginning. Suchomimus shows the middle. Spinosaurus shows the endpoint. The entire story of competition and adaptation and niche partitioning, and the principle of choosing a different direction when your direction is already claimed, exists in the fossil record of three related animals spanning millions of years. The pattern that governs life itself becomes visible through Spinosaurus, readable in bone and chemical signature, a complete illustration of how life survives when the direct path is blocked. Return to the Kem River one final time. Though it exists now only as a record in stone, the river itself is gone. What remains is layered sandstone and mudstone exposed along an escarpment near the Moroccan-Algerian border, under a sky that receives almost no rain, above a ground that holds no water and no life. The landscape is desert, the climate is dry. The river that once flowed through this space, that once sustained an impossible ecosystem of four massive predators, has vanished into deep time. Only the rock announces that the water was ever here. The rock still contains what matters: Fossilized teeth preserve oxygen and calcium isotope ratios that have not changed in 95 million years. The chemical record of two different lives remains locked inside the mineral structure of enamel. One set of teeth carries the signature of a terrestrial predator, a hunter of the ground, an animal that drank from land sources and hunted on solid earth. Another set carries the signature of a creature in the process of leaving the land, moving toward water, committed progressively to a world that its competitor could not follow. The chemistry of those two animals is separated by the width of a river and the width of an evolutionary gulf, both preserved in the same stone. The river is gone. The predators are gone. The competition between Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus was resolved not by one defeating the other through superior strength or cunning. It was resolved by a world that ended for both of them at roughly the same time, by environmental changes too large and too rapid for either animal to survive. They did not outlast each other. They disappeared together, made extinct by forces neither could resist or adapt to quickly enough. What remains is the stone. Inside the stone is the record of a choice, though not a choice made in a single moment or through conscious decision. The Spinosaur lineage did not decide to move toward water. It responded to pressure, generation after generation, to selection that favored individuals slightly better adapted to aquatic life. The choice was made by millions of small evolutionary steps accumulated across millions of years, the weight of selection pressure pointing one lineage toward the water, 1 degree at a time. The process was gradual enough to be invisible to any single animal that lived through it. Yet the result was profound. The animal that eventually emerged was unlike anything the dinosaur world had ever seen. The stone holds this record. The isotopes inside the fossilized teeth preserve the evidence. The bones carry the anatomy. The tail, the skull, the limbs, the density of the skeleton all announce what happened, what the animal became, how completely it committed to a world that no other dinosaur had ever claimed. The story is written in the material itself, readable to anyone who looks carefully enough at the rock, interpretable through the chemistry locked inside the mineral structure, visible in the comparison between one predator and another. The river is gone. The predators are dust. The stone remains, holding inside it the isotopes that tell the story of two lives divided by water, of one animal that chose a different direction when the direction it inherited was already claimed. The long silence of deep time surrounds the rock. The desert stretches across it, and inside, the chemical record persists, unchanged, waiting for anyone who looks to read the story it contains.